Two men lost everything. One in the 6th century before Christ. One in 1944. Neither got an explanation. Both said the same thing. We often try to insulate ourselves from the raw chaos of existence. We build houses with sturdy locks, and we purchase insurance policies, and we tell ourselves that if we behave correctly and eat well and treat others with kindness, the universe will respond in kind. But there are moments in human history and moments in individual lives when the illusion of safety shatters completely. We are left standing in the ruins of what we thought was a predictable world. This is not a comfortable reality to dwell on, but it is the reality that both the ancient text of Job and the modern psychiatric observations of Viktor Frankl force us to confront. When we place these two men side by side, we see a parallel that feels almost unnerving in its precision. Job was a man of the ancient East. We read in the early chapters of his book that he was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He possessed immense wealth and a large family and the respect of his community. And then, in a breathtakingly rapid sequence of events, everything was stripped away. First, his wealth was plundered. Then his children were killed in a sudden collapse of their house. Finally, his own body broke out in agonizing sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He was left sitting in the ashes, scraping his diseased skin with a broken piece of pottery. Total loss, total suffering, total abandonment. Centuries later, a young psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl found himself in a strikingly similar position of total stripping. Frankl was a rising star in Vienna with a promising career and a beloved family, and a manuscript he had been working on for years. But Frankl was also a Jewish man living under the shadow of the Third Reich. In 1944, he was deported to the concentration camps. Over the next several years, he survived Auschwitz and Dachau and other camps. His father died of starvation. His mother was murdered in the gas chambers. His wife died in Bergen-Belsen, his life work. His manuscript was confiscated and destroyed. He was stripped of his profession, his identity, his clothes, and his hair. He was left with nothing but his bare existence. Total loss, total suffering, total abandonment. Both men found themselves thrust into the abyss, and the question that haunted both of them was the question that haunts every human being who endures profound suffering. How do we survive this? What do we do when the pain is not just physical, but existential, when the moral order of the universe seems to have collapsed? Let us look closely at the biblical text. The book of Job is a masterpiece of ancient literature and a profoundly disturbing theological document. Many of us grew up with a sanitized version of this story where Job is a model of quiet patience. But anyone who reads the text honestly knows that Job was not quiet, and he was certainly not patient. After 7 days of silence, sitting in the ashes, Job opens his mouth and he curses the day of his birth. In Job chapter 3, he says, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived." He does not curse God. He refuses to do that even when his wife suggests it. But he curses his own existence. He wonders why light is given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul. We must admit, this is a difficult text to read. We want our biblical heroes to be stoic and unwavering. We want them to offer us neat theological formulas for suffering. But Job gives us raw, unfiltered agony. He gives us the truth of human experience. He forces us to acknowledge that sometimes the pain is so deep that the very gift of life feels like a curse. This is where the text demands our full attention. It does not shy away from the darkest corners of the human psyche. It validates the overwhelming despair that suffering can produce. Enter Viktor Frankl. In his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl describes the psychological reactions of the prisoners in the camps. He observed that the initial shock of arrival was followed by a phase of deep apathy and emotional death. The prisoners were subjected to unimaginable physical and psychological torture. They were starved and beaten and worked to the bone. They saw their fellow inmates die daily. The natural response to such an environment was a descent into hopelessness. Frankl saw many men give up. They would simply refuse to get out of bed one morning, and they would lie in their own excrement until they died. The suffering had crushed them completely. But Frankl observed something else. He noticed that the prisoners who survived were not necessarily the ones who were the strongest physically. The ones who survived were the ones who were able to find or maintain a sense of meaning in their suffering. Frankl frequently quoted the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." For Frankl, this was not just a philosophical abstraction. It was a matter of life and death. The will to meaning, as he called it, was the primary human drive. It was stronger than the drive for pleasure that Sigmund Freud had posited. It was stronger than the drive for power that Alfred Adler had proposed. The most fundamental human need is the need for meaning. Suffering without meaning, Frankl concluded, is unbearable. But suffering with meaning is survivable. It can even be transformative. This is the core of logotherapy, the school of psychotherapy that Frankl founded. Logotherapy focuses on helping the individual find meaning in their life, even in the midst of suffering. How does this map onto the experience of Job? To understand the connection, we must look at the interactions between Job and his three friends. Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar arrive with good intentions. They sit with Job in silence for 7 days. But as soon as Job opens his mouth and expresses his despair, his friends feel compelled to speak. And when they speak, they reveal a profoundly flawed understanding of suffering. Job's friends are the ultimate practitioners of what we might call the explanatory fallacy. They insist on finding a cause for Job's suffering. Their theological framework is simple and rigid. God is just. Therefore, God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Job is suffering immensely. Therefore, Job must have sinned immensely. They spend chapter after chapter trying to convince Job that he is harboring some hidden wickedness. They urge him to confess and repent so that his fortunes might be restored. Frankl would have recognized this dynamic immediately. In his psychological practice, he often encountered patients who were tormented by the need to understand exactly why they were suffering. Frankl explicitly warned against this search for an explanation. He argued that asking why me is ultimately a destructive pursuit because the universe rarely provides an answer. The search for a cause can lead to endless cycles of guilt and resentment. It distracts the sufferer from the more important task of finding meaning in the present moment. Job intuitively knows that his friends are wrong. He knows his own innocence. He knows that his suffering is not a direct punishment for some specific sin. And he recognizes that his friends' explanations are not helpful. In Job chapter 13, he calls them worthless physicians. He says, "You smear me with lies." He realizes that their neat theological formulas are a defense mechanism. They are trying to protect their own sense of a predictable universe by blaming the victim. We often do the same thing today. When we see someone suffering inexplicably, we want to find a reason. We want to find some flaw in their behavior or their choices that explains their predicament. We do this because it makes us feel safe. If they are suffering because of something they did, then we can avoid their fate by making better choices. But Job and Frankl both teach us that this is a dangerous illusion. Suffering is often random and disproportionate. The sufferer does not need an explanation. The sufferer needs a witness. Job's friends fail to be witnesses. They become prosecutors instead. And Job is left alone in his agony. But in the midst of this profound isolation, Job makes a remarkable choice. He refuses to capitulate to the despair that threatens to consume him. He refuses to accept his friends' false accusations. He maintains his integrity even when it costs him everything. In Job chapter 13, verse 15, Job utters one of the most astonishing declarations in all of ancient literature. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He is speaking of God. He believes that God is responsible for his suffering, and yet he refuses to abandon his relationship with God. He demands a hearing. He demands justice. He shakes his fist at the heavens and demands an audience with the Almighty. This is what Frankl would call the defiant power of the human spirit. Frankl believed that human beings have a unique capacity to transcend their biological and psychological and sociological conditions. We are not simply the product of our environment. We have the ability to take a stand against our circumstances. Frankl called this the last human freedom. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Frankl exercised this freedom in Auschwitz. He chose to find meaning in helping his fellow prisoners. He chose to hold on to the memory of his wife and the hope of seeing her again. He chose to observe his own suffering with the detached eye of a psychiatrist, using his experience to formulate his theories. He chose not to let the brutal conditions of the camp extinguish his humanity. Job exercised this same freedom sitting in the ashes. He was stripped of everything, but he retained the ability to choose his attitude toward his suffering. He chose defiance over despair. He chose to contend with God rather than curse God and die. This defiant power of the spirit is closely linked to another of Frankl's key concepts: tragic optimism. Tragic optimism is not the naive belief that everything will be okay. It is not a denial of the reality of suffering. It is the ability to say yes to life, even in the face of unavoidable suffering and guilt and death. It is an optimism that exists not because things are good, but despite things being terrible. Job embodies tragic optimism. In the depths of his despair, he experiences flashes of profound hope. In Job chapter 19, verse 25, he declares, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth." This is a breathtaking moment. Job does not know how his suffering will be resolved. He does not know if he will ever be vindicated in this life. But he holds on to the conviction that a Redeemer exists and that ultimately justice will prevail. This brings us to the profound intersection between Frankl's psychology and the biblical text. Both Job and Frankl recognize that meaning is not found in an explanation of the past, but in an orientation toward the future. Meaning is found in taking responsibility for one's attitude and actions in the present moment. But as we delve deeper into this crossing, we begin to see where the philosopher's framework reaches its limits and where the revelation of Scripture offers something more. Frankl provides a powerful tool for survival. Logotherapy is a brilliant testament to human resilience. But the gospel presents us with a reality that goes far beyond human resilience. Let us turn our attention to the climax of the book of Job. In chapters 38 through 42, God finally answers Job. But the answer God gives is entirely unexpected. God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind, and God does not offer a single word of explanation. God does not tell Job about the heavenly wager with the Satan. God does not explain why Job was chosen to suffer. Instead, God takes Job on a tour of the cosmos. God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" God points to the stars and the sea and the wild animals. God overwhelms Job with the majesty and mystery of creation. Many readers find this response deeply unsatisfying. It feels like God is dodging the question. It feels like God is simply asserting divine power to silence human complaint. But a closer reading reveals something far more profound. God is not offering an explanation. God is offering a presence. God is showing Job that the universe is far larger and more complex than human comprehension. God is showing Job that there are mysteries we cannot untangle. But more importantly, God is showing Job that he is not alone. The creator of the cosmos has condescended to speak to a broken man sitting in the ashes. The answer to Job's suffering is not a philosophical argument. The answer is God himself. This is where we must bridge the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The book of Job leaves us with the mystery of a God who is present in suffering but who remains transcendent and incomprehensible. The gospel brings that presence into the very heart of human experience. Frankl found meaning in suffering. He recognized that suffering could be an opportunity for moral growth and spiritual deepening. But Jesus is the one who takes on suffering. The incarnation is the astonishing claim that God did not remain aloof from the pain of the world. God entered into it. Consider the cross. The cross is not a framework for enduring pain. It is not a psychological technique for finding meaning. The cross is God absorbing the pain of the world into himself. On the cross, Jesus experiences the ultimate depths of human suffering. He experiences physical agony. He experiences betrayal and abandonment. He experiences the suffocating darkness of divine forsakenness. My God, why have you forsaken me? In Jesus, we see the ultimate expression of Job's struggle. We see the innocent sufferer par excellence. But we also see something that neither Job nor Frankl could have fully anticipated. We see suffering defeated from the inside out. Frankl's logotherapy tells us that we must find a way to make our suffering meaningful. It places the burden of meaning-making squarely on human shoulders. This is a noble and necessary task in the face of tragedy. But the gospel tells us that we do not always have to generate our own meaning. The gospel tells us that meaning has already been secured for us. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, the Apostle Paul writes that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. This is not a promise that we will understand why things happen. It is a promise that nothing is wasted. It is a promise that even our most senseless suffering will be woven into the fabric of redemption. We must be careful not to misread this. We often interpret this text to mean that everything happens for a reason. We often try to impose an explanatory framework onto the tragedies we face. But the text does not say that everything happens for a reason. It says that God is at work in all things. There is a profound difference. God is not the author of the evil we suffer, but God is the Redeemer who can bring life out of death. When we read Job alongside Frankl, we gain a deeper appreciation for the human capacity to endure. We learn to reject the shallow explanations of Job's friends. We learn to embrace the defiant power of the Spirit. We learn that we can choose our attitude even in the darkest circumstances. But when we view both Job and Frankl through the lens of the cross, we discover a hope that transcends human capacity. Frankl gives us a way to survive the camps. The gospel gives us a way to defeat death itself. The cross is God's ultimate answer from the whirlwind. It is a presence that shatters all our theological paradigms. It reveals a God who does not simply watch us suffer from a distance, but a God who climbs into the ashes with us. It reveals a God who is acquainted with grief and familiar with sorrow. Frankl observed that those who lost hope in the camps were quickly consumed by death. He argued that we must orient ourselves toward a future goal. We must have a why to live for. For the Christian, that why is not an abstract concept or a personal ambition. That why is a person. Our meaning is rooted in the reality of the resurrected Christ. Job's prophetic cry in chapter 19 finds its fulfillment in the empty tomb. I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand on the earth. This is not logotherapy. This is eschatology. This is the bedrock confidence that the story does not end in the ashes. When we are faced with inexplicable loss, when our world crumbles and our theological structures fail, we are invited to stand in the tension between Job and Frankl and Jesus. We are invited to honestly lament our pain without demanding an immediate explanation. We are invited to exercise the last human freedom and choose our response to the darkness. And ultimately, we are invited to surrender our desperate need to understand to the one who understands us completely. The philosopher gives us the tools to navigate the abyss. The scripture gives us the God who dwells in the abyss with us. Frankl tells us to find meaning so we can survive. The gospel tells us that even when we are too broken to find any meaning at all, the one who is meaning incarnate has already found us. Where does this leave us today? When you look at the broken pieces of your own life or the shattered landscapes of our world, what is your response? Do you demand an explanation that will never satisfy? Do you surrender to the apathy of despair? Or will you dare to stand in the ashes like Job and exercise your ultimate freedom? Will you wait for the voice in the whirlwind, not to explain your pain, but to inhabit it? The text leaves us lingering in the silence, waiting for that presence to arrive. And we must ask ourselves the difficult question. When the explanations fail and the meaning seems elusive, are we willing to trust a Redeemer who bears the scars of the very suffering we seek to understand? But as we have seen, the gospel takes this defiant power and transforms it. The human spirit can rebel against suffering, but it cannot ultimately defeat it. Death still comes for all of us. Frankl survived the camps, but he eventually died. Job was restored, but he too eventually went to the grave. This is why the cross is the necessary conclusion to this reflection. The cross is not merely an example of a man enduring suffering with meaning. The cross is the cosmic event where suffering and death are swallowed up by life. When Jesus hangs on the cross, he is doing something that neither Job nor Frankl could do. He is taking the full weight of the world's brokenness upon himself. He is not just surviving the darkness, he is exhausting it. He is descending into the very depths of the abyss so that the abyss itself can be redeemed. The gospel narratives emphasize that Jesus was entirely innocent. Like Job, he did not deserve his suffering. But unlike Job, Jesus actively chose his suffering. He willingly embraced the cross for the sake of the joy set before him. He became the ultimate victim of the explanatory fallacy. The religious leaders of his day believed he was being punished by God for blasphemy. They looked at his crucifixion and concluded that he was cursed. But the resurrection shatters this false theology. The resurrection vindicates Jesus and demonstrates that his suffering was not a punishment but a profound act of love. It proves that the cross was not the end of the story. This is the eschatological hope that undergirds the Christian view of suffering. We do not merely hope that we can find some subjective meaning in our pain. We hope in the objective reality that pain itself has an expiration date. We look forward to the day when God will wipe away every tear from our eyes and death shall be no more. Frankl's logotherapy is a profound and necessary tool for navigating the present world. It helps us to endure the long night of the soul, but it is the gospel that promises the dawn. So when we read Job, we are not reading a distant historical account. We are reading the blueprint of our own struggles. When we read Frankl, we are not just reading a psychiatric evaluation. We are reading a testament to the resilience of the image of God within humanity. And when we look to the cross, we find the synthesis of all our yearnings. We find a God who understands, a God who suffers, and a God who ultimately saves. The challenge for us is to live in the reality of all three. We must have the honesty of Job to name our pain. We must have the courage of Frankl to choose our attitude. And we must have the faith to trust that the Redeemer who lives will one day stand upon the earth and make all things new.